On the night of November 16th, 2019, the most powerful family in New York was about to make an announcement that would shock the world. But what they didn't know was that their perfect son had been living a lie for 3 years, a lie that would destroy their empire, expose their darkest secrets, and reveal a truth so devastating it would make headlines for years to come. This is that story. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll understand why sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about happy endings. They're about justice. So sit back, grab your popcorn, and ride with me through this survival story. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with your loved ones. Alexander Hartford III, 28 years old, heir to a $47 billion fortune, built on real estate, technology, and pharmaceutical companies, Harvard educated, devastatingly handsome, completely untouchable. On this particular November night, his father, Charles Hartford, was hosting an engagement party at their Manhattan estate. 500 guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, champagne towers, a string quartet flown in from Vienna. Alexander was being engaged to Victoria Ashford, daughter of Senator Ashford, the second most powerful politician in the state. But this wasn't a love match. This was business. You see, the Hartford family had built their fortune through some very questionable means, and Senator Ashford had evidence of their crimes. The engagement was protection, a political alliance that would keep the Hartfords out of prison. There was just one problem. Alexander Hartford was already in love with someone else. Her name was Elena Rodriguez, 26 years old. The daughter of the Hartford family's head housekeeper, Elena, had been cleaning the Hartford mansion since she was 16 years old. While other teenagers were at parties and football games, Elena was scrubbing marble floors and polishing silver. She worked 3 jobs to put herself through community college. She knew every corner of that mansion, every secret passage, every hidden room. She was invisible to the Hartfords, just another servant in a uniform. Or so they thought. The love story between Alexander and Elena had begun 3 years earlier, in the spring of 2016. It was 2 in the morning. Elena had entered the library to clean and found Alexander sitting on the floor, drunk and crying. His father had just told him the truth about how their pharmaceutical company really made money. They had bought up medical patents and raised insulin prices by 4,000%. People had died. Mothers, fathers, children, who couldn't afford their medication. They had died, so the Hartfords could buy another yacht. Elena didn't judge him that night. She just sat beside him and listened. And something shifted. For the first time in his life, Alexander saw past the uniform and the social class. He saw Elena, her intelligence, her strength, her kindness. And Elena saw past the billions and the privilege. She saw a broken man desperate to be more than his family's legacy. Over the next 3 years, they fell in love in secret late-night conversations in the garden, stolen moments when the rest of the family was away. They built a world together in the shadows. But here's what makes this story devastating. On that November night, as Alexander stood in the ballroom with his arm around Victoria Ashford, pretending to smile for the cameras, Elena Rodriguez was standing in the service hallway watching, and she was 5 months pregnant with his child. Alexander didn't know. Elena had been trying to find the courage to tell him for weeks. But every time she tried, reality would crash back in. He was a billionaire. She was a maid. His family would never allow it. So she kept the secret growing inside her. That night, as the engagement was announced and guests applauded, Elena turned to leave. She couldn't watch anymore. But as she walked past a private study, she heard voices inside. The door was slightly open. Charles Hartford was talking to someone, and what Elena heard in the next 60 seconds would change everything. Charles Hartford's voice was cold and calculating. He was talking about a problem that needed to be eliminated. He was talking about making someone disappear, just like he'd done before. And then Elena heard her own name. What did Charles Hartford know? And what was he planning to do about it? Keep watching, because what happens in the next 5 minutes will shock you. And if you're hooked on this story, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because we drop deep cinematic stories like this every single week. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. Elena stood frozen in the hallway, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. Charles Hartford was talking to someone she didn't recognize. The man's voice was cold, professional, the kind of voice that had done terrible things and slept fine at night. Charles was saying that he had discovered Alexander's affair with the maid's daughter. He'd had them followed for months. He had photographs, evidence, and worse, he knew Elena was pregnant. The other man asked what Charles wanted done about it. Charles's response was chilling. He said he'd handled this kind of situation before. There was a private clinic he used, a place where inconvenient pregnancies simply vanished. No questions asked, no records kept. Elena felt her blood turn to ice. She ran to the service quarters where her mother, Maria, was preparing to leave for the night. Maria Rodriguez had worked for the Hartford family for 32 years. She had raised Elena alone after Elena's father disappeared when Elena was just 2 years old. When Elena told her mother everything, the pregnancy, the overheard conversation, Charles's plans, Maria's face went completely white. Maria said there was something Elena needed to know, something she'd kept secret for 24 years. Elena's father, Roberto Rodriguez, hadn't just disappeared. He had been murdered by the Hartford family. Roberto had been an FBI forensic accountant, investigating the Hartford's financial crimes back in 1999. He'd gotten too close to the truth. One night he told Maria he had evidence that would bring down the entire family. 3 days later, his body washed up on the shore. The police ruled it a suicide, but Maria knew better. Before he died, Roberto had given Maria a USB drive containing years of evidence against the Hartfords. He'd also left a letter for Elena to be given to her on her 18th birthday. Maria had never given Elena the letter. She'd been too afraid of what the Hartfords might do if they found out. But now, with Elena's life in danger, Maria pulled out a small locked box from the bottom of her closet. Inside was the USB drive and the letter from Elena's father. The letter explained everything. Roberto had spent years building a case against the Hartford family. He documented murders disguised as suicides, bribes paid to politicians, medical patents weaponized to extort dying patients. He knew they would kill him eventually, but he wanted Elena to have the truth. And more importantly, he wanted her to have the weapon to destroy them. At that moment, Alexander burst into the room. He'd been looking everywhere for Elena. He could tell something was wrong. When Elena told him she was pregnant, she watched his face cycle through shock, joy, and then absolute terror as he realized what his father would do. Alexander said they needed to run. Right now. He would take Elena and Maria somewhere safe, somewhere his father could never find them. But before they could move, Charles Hartford appeared in the doorway with 2 men in dark suits. Charles told Alexander to step away from the girl. He called Elena a complication that needed to be handled. Alexander refused. He stood between his father and Elena and said that if Charles wanted to hurt her, he'd have to go through him first. Charles laughed. He told Alexander he had no idea what was at stake. If Senator Ashford found out Alexander had gotten the help pregnant, the political alliance would crumble. Without that alliance, the evidence the senator had would send the entire family to prison. Alexander said then they'd go to prison. Some things were worth it. For a moment, Charles actually looked surprised. He'd never seen his son stand up to him before. But Charles Hartford hadn't built a billion-dollar empire by backing down. He told the 2 men to escort Elena and Maria from the property. Alexander could either get out of the way or be removed as well. That's when Alexander made his move. He shoved one of the men backward and told Elena and Maria to run. They ran. Out the service entrance, across the grounds, to Maria's old Honda in the parking area. Elena looked back once, and saw Alexander fighting to hold the men off. Then they were driving away, tires screeching, hearts pounding. They thought they'd escaped. They had no idea that Charles Hartford had planned for this exact scenario. 2 miles from the estate, police lights appeared behind them. Multiple cars, sirens wailing. Maria pulled over, confused. They hadn't been speeding. What could this possibly be about? The officers approached with guns drawn. They ordered Maria and Elena out of the car. Maria Rodriguez was being arrested for embezzlement and grand theft. Apparently, over the past 5 years, she'd stolen nearly $200,000 from the Hartford family. Elena was being arrested as an accomplice. Of course, none of it was true. Charles Hartford had manufactured everything. Bank transfers in Maria's name. Stolen jewelry planted in Elena's locker at the estate. False documents with forged signatures. But proving it would take months, maybe years. As Elena was handcuffed and put into the back of a police car, she saw Alexander running down the road toward them. He was screaming something, but she couldn't hear him over the sirens. That was the last time Elena Rodriguez saw Alexander Hartford. 3 days later, while being held in county jail, Elena woke up in the middle of the night with terrible cramps. The stress, the trauma, the fear. It was too much for her body to handle. By morning, she'd lost the baby. The guards found her on the floor of her cell, sobbing, blood soaking through her jail uniform. They took her to the prison hospital, but it was too late. The pregnancy was over. Elena Rodriguez had lost everything, her freedom. Her mother, who was being held in a different facility, her future, and now her child. But here's what the Hartford family didn't know. Elena Rodriguez wasn't just a maid's daughter. She had her father's evidence. She had his letter, and she had nothing left to lose. What happened next would take 5 years, but when Elena was finished, the Hartford family would wish they'd never heard her name. Stay with me, because the revenge that's coming will leave you absolutely speechless. Smash that like button if you want to see these billionaires pay for what they did. 5 years later, November 2024. The Hartford empire was crumbling. Charles Hartford, now 65 years old, looked 20 years older. His hair had gone completely white. He'd developed a tremor in his hands. Hartford Industries was under investigation by 3 separate federal agencies. The insulin price gouging scandal had finally made national news. Families of the dead were demanding justice. Senator Ashford had publicly distanced himself from the family. The political protection was gone. And Alexander Hartford III? He'd vanished. After Elena's arrest, Alexander had suffered a complete mental breakdown. He'd tried to fight for her, tried to expose his father's crimes, tried to prove the charges against Elena and Maria were fabricated. Charles had him declared mentally unstable and committed to a private psychiatric facility upstate. For 2 years, they kept Alexander heavily medicated. Docile, broken. The doctor said he'd developed severe depression and psychotic episodes. He kept insisting his father was a murderer, that Elena Rodriguez was innocent, that there was evidence hidden somewhere. The doctors treated it all as delusion. Then, 3 years ago, Alexander escaped from the facility. No one knew how. One morning, his room was simply empty. The door had been unlocked from the outside. The security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned. Some people thought he'd killed himself in the woods. Others believed he was living on the streets somewhere, too damaged to ever come back. Charles Hartford hired private investigators to find his son, but Alexander had disappeared like smoke. What Charles didn't know was that someone had helped Alexander escape, and that same someone was about to destroy everything Charles had built. It started with a company called Phoenix Holdings. Phoenix Holdings was a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. For 2 years, they'd been quietly buying up Hartford Industries stock. Small purchases. Nothing that would raise alarms. By November 2024, Phoenix Holdings owned 34% of the company. Suddenly, Phoenix Holdings called for an emergency shareholders meeting. They were moving to remove Charles Hartford as CEO. Charles's lawyers did everything they could to find out who was behind Phoenix Holdings, but the company was buried under layers of shell corporations. Dozens of them. Each one registered in a different country. It would take years to untangle. But here's what made Charles Hartford truly terrified. Phoenix Holdings had also filed a massive class action lawsuit on behalf of 847 families who'd lost loved ones due to Hartford Pharmaceuticals' price gouging. And they had evidence. Emails that were supposed to have been deleted years ago. Financial records that had been shredded. Recorded phone calls that should have been impossible to access. Someone had been copying files for years. Someone with access to everything. Charles Hartford realized too late that he'd made a fatal mistake. He'd underestimated the maid's daughter. You see, Elena Rodriguez had been preparing for this moment since she was 19 years old. Remember that USB drive her father left her? It contained years of evidence against the Hartford family. But it wasn't complete. Roberto Rodriguez had died before he could finish his investigation. So, Elena decided to finish it for him. For 7 years, while she cleaned the Hartford mansion, Elena had been conducting her own investigation. She'd hidden a camera pen in her uniform. She'd photographed documents when the family was away. She'd installed keystroke loggers on their computers. She'd recorded conversations using a device hidden in a cleaning cart. By the time Elena was arrested at age 26, she had 14 years of evidence. Everything her father had collected, plus everything she'd gathered herself. The night Elena went to jail, she'd already uploaded all of it to an encrypted cloud server. Maria Rodriguez spent 8 months in prison before the charges were quietly dropped. The evidence against her was so obviously fabricated that even the corrupt judges Charles had paid off couldn't make it stick. Elena was released after 6 months when her public defender, a young woman fresh out of law school, actually did her job and demanded to see the evidence. When it couldn't be produced, the case collapsed. But Elena and Maria didn't go back to New York. They disappeared. For 5 years, nobody knew where they were. What they were doing was building Phoenix Holdings. Elena had taken the evidence her father had collected and used it as leverage, not with the police who she knew were on the Hartford payroll, but with the Hartford's competitors. She approached rival pharmaceutical companies and made them an offer. If they helped her fund a hostile takeover of Hartford Industries, she would give them access to all of Hartford's proprietary research and patents. 3 companies agreed. Elena took the money and started buying stock. Slowly, carefully, using different shell companies, so the purchases couldn't be traced back to a single source. Maria, who had a gift for numbers despite never having gone to college, helped manage the finances. And while they were building Phoenix Holdings, Elena was also doing something else. She was studying. Elena enrolled in online business courses. She learned corporate law. She studied hostile takeovers and shareholder rights and SEC regulations. The maid's daughter transformed herself into a corporate strategist. By November 2024, Elena Rodriguez was ready. The shareholders' meeting was scheduled for December 2nd, Hartford Industries headquarters. Every major investor would be there. The media would be covering it live. Charles Hartford arrived that morning, flanked by lawyers and security. He'd spent weeks preparing his defense. He had counter lawsuits ready. He had character witnesses lined up. What he didn't have was the majority vote. The meeting was called to order. The moderator announced that Phoenix Holdings had requested time to speak. The doors at the back of the conference hall opened, and Elena Rodriguez walked in. She was wearing a black designer suit that probably cost more than the Hartford family had paid her mother in a year. Her hair was pulled back. Her posture was perfect. She looked like she'd been born in boardrooms. Charles Hartford's face went completely white. Elena walked to the front of the room. She didn't hurry. She didn't look nervous. She owned that space. She introduced herself to the shareholders. She said her name was Elena Rodriguez, and some of them might remember her as the maid who'd been falsely imprisoned by the Hartford family 5 years ago. The room erupted in whispers. Elena calmly explained that she was now the majority shareholder of Phoenix Holdings. She was calling for the immediate removal of Charles Hartford as CEO, and the dissolution of the current board. Charles tried to interrupt. His lawyers tried to object. Security moved forward. Elena held up a small USB drive. She said she had 14 years of evidence, proof of the insulin scheme, documented bribes to Senator Ashford, and dozens of other politicians. Records of 3 murders disguised as suicides, including her own father. And she said if anyone tried to stop her, she would release all of it to the press within the hour. The room went silent. Elena turned to face Charles Hartford directly. She said that for years, his family had treated people like her as if they were invisible, as if their lives didn't matter, as if they were nothing. But here's what powerful people always forget, Elena said. The invisible people are the ones who see everything. The vote was called. Charles Hartford was removed as CEO by an overwhelming majority. Within an hour, federal marshals arrived at the building. Charles Hartford was arrested on charges of manslaughter, conspiracy, bribery, and fraud. The cameras caught everything: his expensive suit, his handcuffs, his face finally showing fear. Elena Rodriguez stood in the background of all those photos, watching she'd won. But the story doesn't end there, because Elena wasn't finished. There was still one more person she needed to find, someone she thought was lost forever. And when they finally came face to face, the truth that came out would break your heart. We're in the final act now. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think Elena should forgive the Hartford family? Or is some damage too deep to heal? After the shareholders' meeting, after the arrests, after the media frenzy died down, Elena Rodriguez disappeared again. The press wanted interviews. Lawyers wanted to sue on her behalf. Publishers wanted to buy her story. Elena declined everything. She moved into a small apartment in Brooklyn, nothing fancy. Nothing that screamed revenge or triumph. Just a quiet place where she could finally breathe. One evening, 2 weeks after Charles Hartford's arrest, there was a knock on her door. Elena opened it to find Victoria Ashford standing there. Yes, Victoria Ashford. The woman Alexander had been engaged to marry. The woman who'd been part of the family that had destroyed Elena's life. Elena's first instinct was to slam the door. But something in Victoria's face stopped her. Victoria said she had information about Alexander. She said Elena needed to hear it. Reluctantly, Elena let her in. Victoria explained that she'd never loved Alexander. Her father, the senator, had forced her into the engagement for political reasons. After Alexander disappeared and the Hartford family's reputation started crumbling, Victoria had been trapped in a nightmare marriage to Charles Hartford's business associates. But here's what Elena didn't know. Victoria had been Elena's silent partner for the past 2 years. When Elena had started building Phoenix Holdings, she'd received information from an anonymous source, insider documents, details about Hartford's hidden accounts, warning about security measures. That source had been Victoria. Victoria said that after being forced into the Hartford family, she'd seen their true nature, the cruelty, the corruption, the casual way they destroyed lives. She'd started secretly copying files and sending them to the encrypted email address Elena had set up. When Phoenix Holdings started making moves, Victoria had known it was Elena. So she'd helped. Elena was stunned. She asked why Victoria would risk everything to help her. Victoria's answer was simple, because it was the right thing to do. Then, Victoria said the words that made Elena's heart stop. Alexander was alive. Elena felt the room tilt. She asked where he was. Victoria explained that 3 years ago, she'd helped Alexander escape from the psychiatric facility she'd bribed a guard. She'd provided money and a safe house. Alexander had been living in hiding ever since, slowly recovering from the years of forced medication and psychological abuse. Elena asked why he'd never tried to contact her. Victoria said he had tried, for months. But by then, Elena had disappeared completely. He'd thought maybe she was dead, Or maybe she hated him for not being strong enough to protect her. Eventually, Alexander had given up looking. He'd focused on just surviving, just trying to piece together his broken mind. Victoria said she'd kept him updated on Phoenix Holdings. She'd told him about Elena's return, about the hostile takeover, about Charles's arrest. Alexander's response had been simple. Good. She did what I couldn't. Elena asked if she could see him. Victoria gave her an address in Brooklyn, a small apartment 3 blocks away. That night, Elena stood outside the building for 20 minutes before she could make herself go in. She climbed to the 3rd floor, knocked on apartment 3C. The door opened. Alexander Hartford stood there, and Elena barely recognized him. He'd lost weight. His face was gaunt. He had a beard now streaked with gray. Even though he was only 33, his eyes were haunted in a way that made Elena's chest ache. But when he saw her, those eyes filled with tears. They stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking at each other. Then Elena stepped forward and hugged him, and they both broke down, crying inside the apartment. They talked for hours. Alexander apologized for everything, for not being strong enough, for not protecting her, for letting his father destroy their lives. Elena told him to stop. She said he'd been a victim too. He'd been drugged and imprisoned and gaslit for years. None of this was his fault. Alexander asked about the baby. Elena told him about the miscarriage, told him how she'd lost their child alone in a jail cell while his family celebrated. They cried together for what they'd lost. Then, Elena said something that made Alexander look at her in confusion. She said, "Our son." Alexander didn't understand. Elena explained that she'd been pregnant with twins. One had died, but one had survived. Alexander's face went from confusion to shock to disbelief. Elena told him that after she was released from prison, she'd discovered she was still pregnant. She'd been carrying twins, and while one had been lost in the trauma, the other had held on. She'd given birth in secret. She'd kept the baby hidden for 5 years, using false names and staying off the grid, because she'd known that if Charles Hartford discovered the child's existence, he would have tried to take him, or worse. Alexander asked where the child was now. Elena pulled out her phone and made a call. 10 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. Maria Rodriguez stood there, holding the hand of a small boy with dark curls and Alexander's exact eyes. Elena said, "Roberto, this is your father." Alexander fell to his knees. He was shaking. He reached out a trembling hand, and the boy, curious and unafraid, stepped forward. The boy asked if Alexander was really his daddy. Alexander nodded, unable to speak. The boy, Roberto, named after Elena's murdered father, hugged Alexander tightly. And Alexander held his son and sobbed, like he'd been holding it in for 5 years. Because in a way, he had been. 6 months later, the news was still covering the Hartford trials. Charles Hartford was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison for manslaughter, conspiracy, bribery, and racketeering. He was 65 years old. He would die in prison. Senator Ashford was also convicted on corruption charges. His political career was over. Hartford Industries was restructured under new leadership. Insulin prices were reduced by 90%. The victims' families were awarded over $4 billion in settlements. Elena Rodriguez never married Alexander Hartford. She didn't need his name or his money. She'd built her own empire. But they stayed in each other's lives, co-parenting Roberto, healing together, building something new from the ashes of what they'd lost. Alexander spent 2 years in intensive therapy, working through the trauma of his imprisonment. Eventually, he became a counselor for abuse survivors. Victoria divorced herself from the Hartford name and started a foundation for wrongly imprisoned women. Maria Rodriguez finally got to retire. She spent her days spoiling her grandson and tending to a garden in Elena's backyard. And Charles Hartford? He died alone in his prison cell 3 years into his sentence. A heart attack, the doctor said. No one came to his funeral except the prison chaplain. This story doesn't have a fairy tale ending. Elena and Alexander didn't ride off into the sunset. There was no dramatic kiss, no wedding, no triumphant music. Because real justice isn't about happy endings. It's about accountability. It's about the long, painful work of healing after trauma. It's about choosing to fight, even when the world tells you you're powerless. The maid's daughter didn't marry the prince. She became the queen, and she did it herself. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. If it moved you, hit that subscribe button right now. We post deep, emotionally complex stories like this every single week. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have forgiven Alexander? Or was the damage too deep to ever truly heal? And check the description for our next story dropping in 3 days.